who's working on the show with me tonight. Amy, there you go. 20 to 7 now. Let's have a chat to the great author, John Withington. He's written A Disastrous History of Britain and A Disastrous History of the World, amongst other stuff. Good evening, John.
Hi, Debbie. How are you?
I'm very well.
I hope you're well.
And I hope you're well. This is the strangest year, isn't it? And it is a sort of sample of what went on a very long time ago when they didn't have the science to even help them.
Yes, we may feel it's bad enough today, but there have been much worse plagues in history. And as you say, we have a knowledge of science now which ought to help us. Like the poor people fighting the Black Death or cholera, they had no idea what was causing those diseases initially, so it was a lot harder for them.
So, they didn't realise, I think with the Black Death, it was fleas, wasn't it, immaterial and stuff like that?
Yes, it was the fleas of the black rat were the main way of spreading the Black Death. And as you rightly say, they had no idea what was causing it. And so in some places they even did things like rounding up stray cats and dogs and having them killed off, and that actually probably helped the rats. So if they'd kept the cats and dogs running around, it might have been less bad. But yes, it was a long time before they discovered that it was the fleas of the black rat that were causing the spread of the disease.
And like in the village of Eyam, they went into lockdown, didn't they? They locked all the villagers in, which then they realised when the deaths started to go down, it's because nobody knew and no deliveries were coming into that area.
Yes, that's right, the village of Eyam. And I grew up in Manchester, which isn't very far from Eyam, actually. And it's a very, if people haven't been there, it is a very moving place to visit. And
I'd love to go.
an extraordinary self-sacrifice by the villagers, shutting themselves away like that. In London too, they tried lockdown in a slightly different way. In London, they locked people in their homes. So if you had somebody sick in your house, you would actually be locked in. And I heard actually somebody being interviewed in China recently saying that happened in China during the coronavirus outbreak, that you can be literally locked into your house.
I only know about Eyam because I was in a play at school when I was 11 years old, The Roses of Eyam, where the first nursery rhyme, Ring a Ring a Roses, a pocket full of posies, came from. They used to carry round posies for the smell, because the smell was so bad of death. This is very doer, isn't it? But no, I'm really interested in it. So we're talking about towns like maybe in Cornwall, maybe Bodmin and Truro during the Black Death. What happened there?
Yeah, well, there was no Office of National Statistics in those days, obviously, so all of the estimates about how many people died are very much estimates, but there have been calculations done suggesting that towns like Bodmin and Truro may have lost about half of their population during the Black Death. And we are on slightly further ground with the clergy. There are good records about the number of clergy who died, and there's a calculation suggests that perhaps 40% of the clergy in Cornwall died, and that would be more or less the figure that people normally say for the population loss across England, about 40%. I mean, it's unbelievable when you think how distressing it is for us to have had, whatever it is, 40, maybe 60,000 people died of coronavirus. But when you think that 4 people in 10 were dying, it's no wonder that some people believed it was the end of the world. In fact, probably quite a lot of people believed that.
And of course, being in Cornwall and having that loss of life would have affected horrendously the trade of tin and the stalwart of mining.
Yes, apparently the amount of tin mined by the end of the Black Death in Cornwall was only about a fifth of what it had been before the disease appeared. And of course, agriculture was very badly hit as well. And for decades afterwards, there were stories of land being left unploughed. And we worry about the second wave of coronavirus, don't we? Hear a lot about that. Well, with the Black Death, there was not just a second wave, there was a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and so on. The plague kept coming back. And there was a particularly sad plague which came about 20 years after the Black Death, which became known as the children's plague, because it tended to kill off children because they had not been exposed to the disease. A lot of the adults had been exposed to the disease previously and presumably built up some immunity. So, yes, plague became a frequent and unwelcome visitor.
The one that I'm quite fascinated with, because I've watched a lot of the documentary series and also all the dramas about Henry VIII and all his lives and wives. And during that time, they had something called the sweating sickness, which I didn't understand.
Yeah, the sweating sickness again. And the sweating sickness is still actually But you mentioned Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn nearly died of the sweating sickness before she'd married Henry VIII. So think how different English history might have been if that had happened.
Yeah, she was quite a formidable woman, wasn't she, Anne? She changed everything.
She did, yeah. And Henry was courting her at the time and was very, very upset at being parted from her, as you can imagine, and apparently sent her very wonderful letters. And the sweating sickness certainly appears to have hit Cornwall in 1487 for the first time. It was very much feared because one of the peculiarities of the sweating sickness, it was also known, incidentally, the English sweat sometimes, or the Picardy sweat, but one of the peculiarities of it was that it killed people very quickly. So the saying was you could be merry at dinner and dead at supper.
Good grief. But if you got it, like Anne Boleyn, if you got it and didn't die quickly but was surviving for maybe, I don't know how long, a week or days, then you would get over it.
Yes, as far as we know, it doesn't seem to have left any permanent damage to the people who recovered. As you know, with coronavirus, one of the worries we have is that people's kidneys, people's lungs, people's heart might be damaged even if they recover from coronavirus. That doesn't appear to have happened with sweating sickness so far as we know. But we have to be cautious about all of these things because, this is a time when there are all sorts of illnesses flying around and they're not particularly well documented, but that does appear to be the picture.
But you can imagine doctors at the time and the apothecarists, what were they trying to do? They would have been trying everything, wouldn't they, to try and find something, especially if it was the king's fiancée who was suffering.
Well, you mentioned posies earlier, and one of the and people did carry little posies of flowers around during the plague because that was thought to be possibly a way of warding off the plague. There were all sorts of crab's eyes were suggested. If you've got a bit of money, you could try jellied vipers covered with gold leaf.
Oh my goodness me!
Expensive. And then later on, smoking tobacco was suggested.
Yes, of course.
But no evidence that any of those things helped, unfortunately.
But if you think back to that time as well, and all the dandies and all of the rich people would walk around with hankies in front of their faces, which really were the first masks, weren't they?
Yes, I suppose that's right. And again, there was this feeling that illness might be connected with bad smells, and that persisted for quite a long time. So when cholera first appeared in the 19th century, again there was this idea that it might be sort of spread by bad air. But conversely, one of the other things that they did during the plague was they sometimes opened the sewers because they thought the terrible smell from the sewers might drive away the illness.
Yeah. And cholera appeared, there was a victim, a poor person died at Bodmin very early on, didn't they?
That's right, yes. Cholera first appeared in 1832, and the first victim known in Cornwall was a woman who was travelling from Devonport to Port Isaac, and she died at Bodmin. And people were absolutely alarmed because they'd heard of the stories from the northeast of England, Sunderland, and from London about cholera, so they were very worried. And when they tried to bury her in the town, there was a riot. Sadly, the cholera did get through most of Cornwall, killed about 300 people, and it was tended to be, as you probably suspect, with a disease like that, spread by poor drinking water. It tended to be the big towns or the ports around the river estuaries that tended to be the worst affected.
And for you now, just to think about today, we're going back and talking about these awful diseases back, decades, hundreds of years ago. What do you think they'll make in hundreds of years' time about 2020 and the coronavirus?
Well, that's a very good question. A lot depends on how it turns out, doesn't it? We really don't know how this is going to turn out. And we talked earlier, will there be a second wave? Let's hope not. But will there be? We don't even know if there's going to be a vaccine, do we? I mean, there's some promising research.
Well, they're working on it, they say.
And you would imagine that they're working on it pretty energetically. But if there's no vaccine, is it going to be a disease that we have to live with for a long time? I suppose the heartening thing is that we said earlier that we didn't know what caused the plague, we didn't know what caused cholera, but we found out. So we found out that it was the fleas. We found out it was contaminated drinking water that was causing cholera. There are a lot of things that we don't know about coronavirus, but at least we start from a much higher base of medical knowledge. And if you listen to doctors, they say, don't they, that they're learning the whole time about this virus. Every day they learn something new about it. I suppose the other thing that may happen is that, of course, it could have very profound economic consequences. The Black Death had huge economic consequences, but the Black Death actually was a huge blow for what you might call the working class, because there was a great labour shortage. All these people had died, and so the ordinary worker actually started to get a much better deal after the Black Death.
Yeah, because of the shortage of it, yeah.
Absolutely.
It is a strange time, and it's one where you think maybe generations to come we will all be socially distanced, because we think about we're lucky to have soap and water. That's the thing that's keeping it at bay. They say wash, 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 soap and water, but of course back in those days of the Black Death, they didn't have soap. They weren't clean. And so therefore that's one benefit we may have to try and stop the spread.
Absolutely. And one of the great puzzles of history, and not ever really been satisfactorily explained, is why did the plague die out? And so the last great outbreak in England of the plague was the 1660s, and then it disappeared. It didn't disappear from the continent as quickly as that, and all sorts of theories are advanced. Did the brown rat replace the black rat, and did the fleas not sort of go on the brown rat? And anyway, the brown rat doesn't like people as much as the black rat, so maybe that was a factor. But the thing you just mentioned is cleanliness, and that's another thought as to why the plague died out. There were better living conditions, cleaner houses, and just better personal cleanliness. But it does remain a bit of a mystery.
Fascinating. I could talk to you for much longer. We'll talk again at some point again, but absolutely fascinating talking to you. If you'd like to get John's books, Disastrous History of Britain and A Disastrous History of the World, available, I imagine, online, John?
They are indeed.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. Take care, won't you?
And to you. Stay well.
And wash those hands. Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye.